Wednesday morning, my friends. I'm Pastor Ben Hayes from First Baptist Church, Dadeville, Alabama, bringing you our thought for the day on this thankful Thursday. What are you thankful for? I'm thankful for you, and I'm thankful that you're going to share these videos on your social media so that we can get the word out. That's what this is all about: is sharing the love of Christ, the hope of the gospel, with the world around us. God's purpose and plan. Remember, I talked about that yesterday, and He's got a purpose and plan. As we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11, we may not understand completely all of that purpose and plan, but understand this: God's purpose for your life is always the best thing for your life. If you're outside of God's purpose, then you're struggling, you are hurting, you are fighting against the current. But if you're inside of that purpose, if you're living out God's purpose, it's like a sailboat under the power of the wind. The Holy Spirit is just blowing you forward, moving you to where you need to be. So always look to be within that purpose and plan of a Holy Father. But again, this passage that we're looking at is kind of a tough one for women who feel like they have the right. And please understand, Paul did more to elevate women than any other biblical writer besides Jesus. We don't tend to think of him that way, but he did. And some ladies feel like the Bible pushes them down. But what Paul does is try to elevate them to accomplish, to experience the purpose and plan that God has. Because remember, God's purpose is always best. And this passage is a little bit confusing, picking up in 1 Corinthians 11:4. Paul writes, "Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if her head were shaved." Wow. See, and here's the part that is so hard to get your mind around. The Jewish faith, which Paul comes out of, believed that men's heads should be covered when they prayed. That's why they wore the kippah, the yarmulke that they would wear, and to cover their head, and still do today. And even the prayer shawl they would put over their head before they would pray. And so you have to say, what is pushing this? What is causing Paul to write this? And I think it's a cultural concern there in Corinth, because what was happening is that these pagan worshipers were doing these things. And what Paul is trying to get across to these Christian believers is you've got to be completely different from the world. And so, guys, instead of covering your head, leave it uncovered as you pray to God. Ladies, instead of leaving your head uncovered, which, by the way, a lot of these pagan women and some of these Christian women who were not living holy lives would adorn themselves with fancy hairdos that would have gold and jewels within them, and it was kind of this idea of saying, look at me," kind of thing. And especially the prostitutes, the shrine prostitutes, the temple prostitutes would do those kinds of things, trying to draw attention to themselves. And so Paul is saying to these women, be modest in your appearance as you pray, and so cover your head instead of coming before God with this kind of what we would call bling, what this kind of adornment that would call attention to yourself. Because listen, it's not about us, it's about God. It's about following Him and doing what He has called us to do. And so we ought to also understand this, because look what he says in verse 6: "If a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn." In other words, instead of having all of that adornment, just cut it all off. "But it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved. Let her be covered." And so what he's saying here is just do this for the sake of your testimony, for the sake of your witness, which is what he's been talking about in all of this. We have to surrender our rights for the good of others. We have to subject our desires, right, so that others will not be offended or caused to stumble, that we would not look like the rest of the world. And this is important to Paul. We are not to look like the rest of the world, because we have been called to be holy as God is holy. We are called to be different, set apart from the world, so that the world can see there's something different about us. Because if they think that we're just exactly like them, then they see no need to be saved. And that's what's so important here. We are to follow God's purpose and plan, even if it means we do things contrary to what we want to do so that we can reach a lost and hurting world. Paul says, I become all things to all people, whereby I might reach some. Think about that. Is your heart really there to reach the lost? Listen, I'm going to tell you something. One of the big things in the past years has been this war on worship music. And so many of our senior adults who are just so set against these praise choruses. Listen, if that's what reaches these younger families, then we need to do that. Surrender your rights. Surrender your desires. Let God win. Think about that today. Be blessed. I'll see you back here tomorrow.